And the war on drugs now. Recently, my dad visited me from Colombia, and he brought me some coffee. It's called Doña Juana, and that is the name of a volcano in our region. It's very close to where he grew up, his hometown. I love my coffee, like a good Colombian. Coffee is an upper, also known as a stimulant. That means that it enhances the brain activity, increases alertness, increases energy, and euphoria. Coffee is not the only stimulant that my country, Colombia, is famous for, but it is the only legal stimulant that Colombia is famous for. When you talk about cocaine to many Colombians, you may elicit a reaction. It can be they may feel insulted. They may get angry. I am not like that. I've taken the red pill when it comes to the war on drugs. Are you ready to be red pilled? If you are, let's do it. Firstly, what is a drug? A drug is simply a chemical substance that, often in very small quantities, alters the way in which your body works, obviously including your behavior. Common wisdom, normies, tell us that some drugs are worse than others. Some drugs, like coffee, are good and healthy enough to power you through the workday. Power you and give you the strength that you need to stay awake, to survive in this late stage capitalist society. Some other drugs are good for weekend nights and special occasions. I'm talking about alcohol. However, some drugs are just so bad that big daddy government takes them away from little you. Is that true though? Let's check in with the experts. In 2010, there was a study done by the UK Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. This was published in The Lancet, and they ranked the most dangerous drugs. We're going to take a look at that list, at that ranking. Before that, obviously, alcohol should not be anywhere near the top of the list, because alcohol is legal and is a lot less bad than cocaine or heroin, because those are big, bad, and scary. Let's take a look. Very interesting. Actually, coming up on number 1 in terms of the most dangerous drugs is alcohol, which is legal. Tobacco is also there, which is legal too. According to this, tobacco is not as bad as ecstasy, which is illegal. Am I saying that we should make alcohol illegal since it's so bad? No, not at all. Prohibition and criminalization is how we wind up with lots of the drugs in this list. The iron law of prohibition tells us that when substances are criminalized, the hardest versions of these substances become the norm. If you want an explanation on the iron law of prohibition, feel free to watch one of my previous videos, link in the description. Violence is another evil of prohibition and criminalization. Let's see why. When a popular product becomes criminalized, becomes illegal, it does not disappear. Entities outside of the law get to control the supply and the sale. Yet, at every stage of that process, this illegal or criminalized product or substance is vulnerable. Let's use a bit of empathy. Imagine that you are in this line of business, in this line of work, and somebody steals your stash. Somebody steals the illegal product that you were trying to sell or maybe to use. Can you go to the cops or to the courts to get some justice, to get it back? You could if you wanted to get in some real serious trouble. When something is criminalized, there is just one way to defend it. To defend that product or that property. And that is with violence. You don't want a shootout every day because we are not in a Scarface kind of movie. In this line of business, you are rewarded by establishing a reputation. You want to make people very terrified from you so that nobody even wants to think about messing with you. And you accomplish this with attention-grabbing acts of brutality. In his 2001 ethnography called The Power of Violence in War and Peace, Professor Philippe Bourgeois called this phenomenon a culture of terror. A lack of moral restraint conveys people who are in this line of business a competitive advantage over their rivals in their quest to control their market. That is how we arrive at rival cartels butchering not only their enemies, but their enemies' relatives, their families, in ways that really, if we were to go into them, they actually haunt your nightmares. The real point here is that prohibition creates a system in which sadistic violence is functional, is logic, and it is also required and rewarded. Nobody here is saying that alcohol is good for you. I'm just saying that the Jose Cuervo cartel is not in a bloody war with the Jack Daniels cartel. Some people may argue, but if all of these substances become illegal, unregulated, unavailable, use and abuse of drugs would be everywhere, would be widespread, right? Not necessarily. Actually, drugs are just a tiny part of the problem. Drugs as substances themselves. Very small part. The traditional pharmaceutical medical theory of addiction, which most of us know, tells you that your brain and your body kind of becomes taken over by a substance, kind of like possessed. They have these studies in which they take a rat, a laboratory rat, and they put the rat in a box. The rat has access to two different sources of water. One source of water is just water. The other source has a drug laced in the water. Sometimes it can be morphine or any other drug. And what happens is that the rat consumes the water with the drug, very, very high rates of consumption until the rat dies of an overdose. And that is sad. But now there is a new spin. Let me tell you about a new spin in that traditional rat study of addiction. This is called Rat Park, and it is going to blow your mind. So in this new study, instead of putting the rat in a solitary confinement box, the rats get to live in a park, kind of like a paradise for rats, in which there is plywood walls, there is running wheels, there are toys, there is good food, and very importantly, there is other rats, so they can have friends, they can have lovers. Yet again, like in the traditional old experiment, the rats in Rat Park have two sources of water. One has a drug, morphine, and the other one is just water. Rats in Rat Park hardly used any drugs. They did so in very small amounts and occasionally. They didn't kill themselves. Instead of overdosing by drinking the water with the drug, they decided to spend their lives doing something else, other things. The theory that we get to formulate from that piece of data and evidence is that drugs are not the reason of harmful drug-using behavior. It's not about drugs. It's the environment. A rat with a good life almost never develops heavy drug use, even though the drugs are available to them. Drug use is an adaptation to a challenging environment. You may say, those are rats, we are humans, we're different. You will be surprised how similar we are, but let's say you are correct. Let's talk about humans. 20% of the US soldiers became heavy users of opiates like heroin during the Vietnam War. And this is according to a study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry. From these users, GIs, veteran soldiers, 95% of them stopped using opiates within 1 year of coming back to the US. Some of them got rehab and treatment, some of them did not. It actually didn't make a difference. A very small number of these veterans continue to use. Almost all of them happen to have had unstable, troubled childhoods, and happen to be users of opiates before going to Vietnam. Very small amount. The traditional medical pharmaceutical theory of addiction which tells us that your brain and your body is hijacked, possessed by a drug, can't explain how these veterans stop using, or how the rats in Rat Park use tiny amounts occasionally of drugs. However, a new environmental theory of drug use actually can explain that. In Vietnam, which was a terrible war which the US lost, it was also very, very dumb. Young men, young soldiers, were in the jungles, in which people that they couldn't see were trying to kill them for reasons that they couldn't understand. They were really bad reasons. These soldiers needed maybe to have a fix, to use some drugs, because they were in a terribly stressful, challenging environment. However, if your environment is like Rat Park, in which you're safe, you're happy, you have a community, you have healthy connections and fun things to do, you may not be vulnerable to drug use or abuse. And if your environment is like a solitary cage, confinement, you feel alone, powerless, purposeless, and you may be vulnerable to drug use and abuse. The rats in solitary confinement in the traditional experiment and the Vietnam veterans weren't being hijacked by some mysterious magical chemical substance, also known as a drug. They may have been trying to cope with being separated from everything that gave their lives meaning, pleasure, purpose. In his 2008 book, known as The Globalization of Addiction, Professor Bruce Alexander explains that humans evolve with a need to bond, a need to connect. If you think about it, this is a need that is essential for us to stay alive. And if we take a look at history, mass drug use suddenly takes off in humans when connections and bonds are suddenly taken away from them. For example, mass alcoholism has shown up in Native Americans of North America after they were stripped of their land and of their culture and genocided too. Also, in the 18th century, there was the gin craze in England. Around the same time as industrialization took poor people from their lands, from the countryside, into the new and scary cities. Also, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the crack epidemic occurred at the same time as US inner cities were stripped from factory jobs and communities in a historical phase known as deindustrialization. These are not coincidences. Hyper-individualistic, frantic, crisis-ridden societies make most people feel socially and culturally isolated. These days, lack of healthcare, the cost of higher education, the housing crisis, wealth inequality, a minimum wage that has not kept up with inflation, mass shootings, lack of gun control, hustle or grind culture. All of these are forces that prevent us from having opportunities and connections and enjoying our lives. I would argue that those are the problem, not drugs. People may find temporary relief in drugs. People do need a system that values human life over profit, way more than they will ever need drugs. Nobody's saying that drugs are not bad for your health. I'm not saying that. But it's also not good for your health to eat fast food, sugary drinks, processed meals, or to live in the isolated US suburbs in which you sit on your couch and drive your car everywhere that you want to go. Now you may say, if the war on drugs is such a terrible idea, why did it even happen? That's a good question. I definitely have asked myself that, and I'll explain it in just one word. Racism. Don't take it from me. Take it from John Ehrlichman, Assistant to the President for Domestic Affairs. He served under everyone's favorite president, Richard Nixon. This is a quote from him about the war on drugs. Quote, "You want to know what this war, the war on drugs, was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Unquote. There you have it. Straight from the pig's mouth. Many early drug laws were created during times of immigration from places like China or Mexico also. There are many evidence of campaigns to associate immigrants with drugs and to villainize immigrants. It's kind of still happening. The war on drugs is nothing but an excuse to oppress people of color through policing, mass incarceration, and imperialism. Incarceration rates for non-violent drug offenses increased by 800% as a result of the war on drugs in the US. The war on drugs should never have happened. Our people need connections and a good life. We used to have cocaine in Coca-Cola. We used to have opiates like heroin in syrups and teas. We used to have users of these substances not dying from overdose, living normal, average lives, functioning in society. Repeat after me. The war on drugs is not about health. It's not really even about drugs. The war on drugs is about racism and the oppression of marginalized people around the world. You have been red pilled. Stay safe, stay strong, and fight to end the war on drugs today. Bye.